Okay. Why is it doing this? All right, so we got through the nature, and we'll have a lot more to say about this as we move through the semester. And so this is just kind of again the preview of what we would call the nature of humans, and it's an overarching philosophy. Um, I'm going to leave the structural versus functionalism out of our conversation for now until we get to cultural psychology, because I don't want to confuse how it's used in the study of psychology with the analysis of different systems and what the functions of those systems are. So I'm going to leave this one for now, and we'll come back to it probably in a couple weeks. So we'll come back to this notion of structuralism versus functionalism. I did want to bring up, because we've gone through all of these different philosophies and theories. It's mainly been taken from a Western perspective, and I just wanted to bring up a Otham perspective, but I want to make it clear from the beginning. One of the very first things I learned, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this on Monday, is that there's many philosophies within the Otham nation. And so this is just one perspective, and it comes from one of our cultural instructors, Camillus Lopez, who is also a elder on the nation. And if you ever get the chance, and if you haven't gotten the chance to go listen to his storytelling times when he does it in different areas, I would encourage you to do it. It's a very interesting. And our man in the maze, you'll notice this guy right here. He's also the one that developed that man in the maze process that we're going through here in class. But based on what his interpretation of traditional stories and traditional ways of being, this is kind of his interpretation of these different philosophies. One thing that he has said about the difference between good and evil is that he believes that individuals have both good tendencies and evil tendencies. And he takes this, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing this. He took the example of the bon, or in English, the coyote, and how in traditional stories, the coyote can be devious in some cases and create chaos. But in other cases, he actually helps the Otham people. So this dual nature of the coyote and in his interpretation suggests, because we are like nature in this aspect, that we all have good and evil tendencies within us. Now, going back to the mind-body problem, he actually suggests that we have three aspects of the individual, okay? He thinks that we have the physical body, and this is the kind of the, if you want to think of hardware or the instrument in which we navigate through the world. But then he separates the mind from the soul and the spirit, okay? The mind in this philosophy is that thing that guides us through the physical world. It guides the body. It guides our understanding of how we should behave and act in this physical world that we're in. And then he suggests that the soul and spirit transcend both the physical mind and the physical body, that it is something that is beyond those two things. He basically, and he suggests that the soul and spirit is kind of the energy that gives the body its ability to exist. And so very much maybe kind of like the Greek notion that our soul gets us moving in the world, and then of course with our last breath our soul leaves our body in that way, and then hence and I don't want to get into this because I don't know enough about it. Hence, this brings about the ceremonies that the Otham people do when it comes to a person passing on to the next world or next place. So I just wanted to bring this up because there are different perspectives on all of these ideas, as we have mentioned. And again, if we went to even to different regions within the Otham Nation, or even different Native American nations across the United States, these would all be kind of different. The interpretation of this mind-body problem, nature, nurture, the nature of human beings would have a distinct uh, I'll use this word, a distinct flavor based on the history, the language, and the culture of those peoples. So I just wanted to bring this up as we move along. So let's talk about some of the ways that psychology has um, approached psychology, and in some sense culture as well. And the one place to start is with Sigmund Freud, and you might remember this fellow from either your sociology class or your psychology class if you've taken him, or even just in popular culture with memes on Facebook. And he's the guy that came up with the mother issue type stuff, that can be quite humorous when you're looking at memes on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. But the reason why I want to start with Sigmund Freud is he kind of gives us one of our first modern theories of the mind and its origins. Okay, and he is also a good place to start because he originally, just to give you some background on Sigmund Freud, if you haven't heard this, is that he very much was a scientist to begin with. He went to one of the finest universities in Germany, worked with some of the brightest minds in the field of neuroscience for the time. And I believe his dissertation was something about the nervous system of a frog or something like that. But because he was Jewish, he was unable to get into the scientific academies in order to continue his scientific pursuits. And so he hung up his science coat, and he went and opened a medical practice, um, for to practice medicine. Now, I don't want to get too far into the his practice, but the basis of it is that he did use his clinical population to develop this idea of the mind, or his interpretation of the mind. Um, and probably an important kind of theory that we're going to use throughout the class, is he very much wanted his theory to be grounded in science. So the theory that he used at the time was Charles Darwin evolutionary theory to develop his theory. And at the time, Charles Darwin was kind of a superstar. Yeah, and the evolutionary theory was being used for the basis of biology, anthropology, and now we're going to enter into the field of psychology. And what Freud argued is that we have to have something that makes the entire human race survive. We have to have some drives that whether you live in an Asian culture or an American culture or a South American culture, we have to have something that makes the human race survive and adapt to its environment. Now, he's going to state that everybody basically has two basic drives. We have the drive, what is known as the death instinct and the life instinct. And he's going to narrow these down to sex and aggression. We have to reproduce, to spread on, or to continue the human race, right? The human existent species. I should use the word human species. And we have to protect that human species through aggression, and ultimately death. And that is the basis of human existence. But what he argued is that these are unconscious drives, that we don't have access to them. We have something called an ego that looks at the outer world and tries to determine the best outcome for the individual while satisfying the needs of the id, which is where the uh, two drives are at. So that's the basis of his theory, and we're not going to get into it much deeper than that. Other than there is some interesting things that I would encourage everyone to read about Sigmund Freud. There's two books. You can Google them. One is Society and Its Discontent, where Freud analyzes society, and we'll, when we get into cultural psychology, we might look at this a little bit more. Um, uh, but this is where he talks about, you know, culture and cultural's influence on the repression of our two basic drives to reproduce and to aggression. And I think that it is worth reading if you are um, um, uh, into literature. It is considered a great literature. But we will talk about it a little bit more as we get into cultural psychology. The other thing that is kind of an interesting uh, dialogue with Freud is his Albert Einstein wrote him a letter, and Einstein at the time was very concerned. We're World War I, World War II, very destructive. And he writes a letter to Sigmund Freud asking, why are human beings so destructive? What is our nature in this? And Sigmund Freud provides a simple answer about the aggressive drive that we have. But again, I don't want to get into this too much. It's a really interesting read to kind of look at, you know, the dialogue between Einstein and Freud on what is the nature of aggression, what is the nature of human destructiveness. And it's a pretty good read. I just wanted to, I don't want to get too deep into these theories. That's why I'm just kind of giving some recommendations at this point. But those are some really interesting reads. Now, what did Freud say about culture? Okay. Freud believed that culture was a mechanism that the ego uses to control our impulses, our sexual and and aggressive drives. And so he doesn't pay much attention to quote unquote culture. What he pays attention to is the environmental demands that it puts on a group of people's egos. And then that group of people have to use a tool such as culture, law, government to, within that environmental restraint, to control everyone's sexual and aggressive drives. Okay. Um, but I think someone else, one of his proteges, Carl Jung, would maybe have a better description of why culture and why across cultures we have similarities. Because what we will get into with Carl Jung later in the course is this notion of a collective unconscious. In fact, a lot of Native American psychologists and Native American writers look at Carl Jung's writing to help explain the philosophical notions of things like historical trauma and those types of things. So he, again, for those who are interested in exploring things like historical trauma, I'd highly recommend reading some books by Carl Jung because he gives this perspective that culture evolves because of the collective, that we have these different layers in the unconscious of the peoples we come from. And that we have these propensities to understand our world based on our historical past, not only our personal historical past, but our generational historical past. And then he also used the collective unconscious to explain cross-culture similarities, because we haven't found a culture that does not have some representation of a mother, some representation of a father, and some representation of a hero and villain. Those are what Carl Jung referred to as archetypes, in that within the human mind, regardless of culture, we have those four things that it seems that we're born to understand. And some research to support this is if we take infants across cultures again, and so this has been done, I believe, here in the United States, and it's been reproduced. Yeah, gosh, I can't even remember what Asian nation. I think it was either Japan or maybe China. I'm sorry, I apologize. I can't remember, but an Asian country where we took infants as young as about 4 to 6 weeks old. And we showed them, and we use the same pictures across nations, Asian, whether it's Asian or United States, we use the same pictures. So it's not culturally bound, is what I would say. So we took pictures of, let's say, Charles Manson, and there were several pictures. I'm just going to use two examples. Charles Manson versus Martin Luther King, okay? And the things that the experimenters were looking for is, do the infants do avoidant behavior? So they don't stare very long at it. They kind of twist their body. Maybe they start to make distressed crying sounds. Or do they do approach behavior, such as reaching out their arms, having extended view time, and those types. So they're looking for approach behaviors or withdraw behaviors. And across cultures, when we shown babies pictures of Charles Manson, they do the withdraw behaviors. When we show them pictures of like Martin Luther King or Mother Teresa, they do approach behaviors. Okay, and this kind of goes back to Carl Jung's idea that across cultures we have a notion of heroes versus villains, or people who are good for us versus people who are bad for us. Okay. And then, of course, we've done the same with notions of mother and father, mainly using language analysis, not necessarily infants, but language analysis between different cultures. So this will be a topic in that we do want to look at when we get to cross-cultural psychology, is what are those things that seem to be human bound versus culturally bound? Because even though we have the notion of mother and father, culture determines on how mother and father and family and villain and good person are defined. And I brought up the example of relationship differences between here in the Western United States versus Amazonian locations on Monday. So the next two movements that we want to look at are behaviorism, which here in the United States started in full force around the 1913s, if not a little earlier. And it dominated American psychology well up into the 1950s. In fact, I'd argue well into the 1960s. And what the notion of behaviorism is, and this is an important point to be made. Behaviorists would say that we develop cultures out of a reward and punishment system. Okay, Basically, what the behaviorists would say is we ignore the mind. What they would say is your thought processes, your moral ideas, your belief systems are really a byproduct of a stimulus in the environment, a demand in the environment, and the behavior of the individuals. Okay. So, what they would argue as far as culture is concerned is that the differences in behaviors that you see don't have basis in religion, morality, um, systems within a culture. What they would argue is it's a collection of similar stimuluses in the environment and the behaviors that they elicit. And so for behaviorists, if you want to think of it this way, cultures are amoral. That if you want to break a negative cycle within a culture, you have to break the connection between the stimuluses and the behaviors that are within that environment. Okay. So again, going back to more of that evolutionary theory, we see this idea of the environment really determining what the culture within a area is going to be, or within a group of people is going to be. Probably a critique of behaviorism would be is, do we have tendency to reinforce cultural beliefs through this reward and punishment system? Absolutely. You want to think about it in this tense. If you get on Facebook, or I know not a lot of people use Facebook anymore, but Instagram or TikTok, and you give some cultural point of view, you're either going to be rewarded for that view, or you're going to be put down for that view, and then you're going to find your people, and then you're going just to elicit that view to those. So we use reward and punishment quite often. Okay. So that's the behaviorist view of what would determine culture from a reward punishment perspective. And again, when we take it from this view, our thoughts and beliefs about morality, about religion, about language, all of those things are just a byproduct of stimulus response associations, which means we don't have control over those things. And I just want to make that point. Okay. Now, behaviorism as a science didn't last long. We will see here in just a few minutes. We had what's called the cognitive revolution, which really is kind of said, no, we're more than just robots that are responding to stimuli in the environment. We have thoughts, we have feelings, we have beliefs, we have emotions, and those have a influence on how we behave. Hence, we can get rebellion within a culture. We can get cultures within a culture because we all have the ability to interpret that culture in our own way. Coming into the 1950s, we have what's called the humanistic approach, and I think for this one, it gets into Abraham Maslow's. If everyone probably knows about the hierarchy of needs, and what we're all driven towards is this idea of self-actualization, and that in order to reach self-actualization, we have to have certain needs in place. And we have to have someone in our life that provides us something called unconditional. In lay terms, it's called unconditional love. In the humanistic thing, it's called unconditional regard, meaning that you're with someone who doesn't provide judgment for you. And then that at that point, you can reach self-actualization, which is the full understanding of one's person, both the good and the bad. But what I want to emphasize for our conversation about culture is their notion of free will and where that notion comes from. The notion of, first of all, the humanistic approach developed out of a philosophy known as existentialism. Okay. During the time in the 1950s, we were deep, at least here in the United States, we were deep into conflicts within the Asian countries. We just came out of World War One, World War Two. Conflict in Vietnam is starting to creep up, and then we have also the Cold War really starting to take off. And so the world looked very destructive. It looked very, are we destroying ourselves was a predominant theme at the time. And so this notion of, and I'll explain what it is in its most basic terms, this notion of existentialism really took root for a lot of people, because what existentialism establishes is what the basis of existentialism is, that we're born into a meaningless, chaotic world, that really we don't have meaning, that nothing, the earth has no meaning, animals and plants have no meanings, the sun really has no true meaning. Humans, therefore, really are born meaningless. Okay. So, as conscious beings, in order to provide meaning to our life in a meaningless world, we create things like religion, we create government, we create schools and legal systems and all of these things to provide meaning and structure in a chaotic, senseless world. Okay. With that, though, and this is where it gets into the humanistic approach, unlike behaviorism, unlike Freudian psychology, if we're born into a meaningless world, that means we have free choice to determine our own fate. So we have free will. We have free will to determine our own life and our own place in it. And then we are only restrained by the systems of quote unquote culture. Okay, meaning that we're all born with this ability to make decisions and everything else. But what restrains us now, because if the world is meaningless, the restraints are set by human beings. What restrains us now is our own cultural and our cultural beliefs about the meaning of religion, the meaning of government, the meaning of language, all of those different things. So again, this just kind of gives a notion again about how the meaningfulness of culture and why it has developed to be the way it is, at least from a humanistic perspective. Okay. So I do want to bring up, trying to wrap up our conversations within this area. I do want to bring up two other things. Well, we're actually going to talk about four, but two other notions of study starting in the 1900s. Is the study of social psychology, which is when we look at cross-cultural psychology and cultural psychology, social psychology is the umbrella for both of these studies. Okay, because what social psychology studies and what we will be focusing on a lot in this class is the influence of a group, so a culture, on the individual, and the individual's influence on a group or a given culture, because it is a reciprocal relationship between the individuals within a culture and the defining features of that culture. Okay. And some of the things that social psychology really focuses on is the notion of situationalism. Okay. More than individual personality and individual motivation, we understand within this field that the situation a person is in matters. It motivates our behaviors, it motivates what we do. And in the context of cultural psychology, that is the situation. When we look at how to act in a given situation, we use our knowledge about our own culture to try and determine what is the appropriate behavior for that given situation. And this is why, for example, a lot of presidents, for example, will have a staff that when that individual goes and visits another country or something like that, the staff who are experts in those areas will tell the president, how to shake hands, how to introduce themselves, how to behave in a culturally appropriate way, so not to offend that culture in and of itself. So understanding that is kind of important. The other thing that we're interested in is subjective experience. So, and again, we'll get a lot of this into when we talk about cultural psychology, is what is the individual's experience of that culture? Okay. And so I would be willing to bet, and this is kind of the subjective experience. I would be willing to bet is that a lot of LGBTQ individuals living in the United States culture have a very different view of the culture, a different view of how they're treated within this culture than, say, non-LGBTQ people. And we can even go beyond this. We have this broader Western culture. We could probably go to each Native American nation. We can go to Hispanic communities, Black communities, white communities, and they all are having this very different subjective experience of what Western culture is and their place within it. Okay. But again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I just want to give these kind of overviews. And so that is the state of where we'll be looking when we get to cultural psychology. The other area of psychology that we'll be taking a look at is what's called developmental psychology. And the basic definition of developmental psychology is how do we change behaviorally, socially, and psychologically over time. All right. And this is where we're going to look at, what are some similarities between cultures and what are some differences. And I think I may have mentioned this maybe in the first class or maybe class Monday is different cultures give different focus on language. There's some cultures that heavily focus on reading to their children, exposing them to language and whatnot. And then on another extreme end, there's cultures who don't even speak a word to their children for the first couple years. But across cultures, children start to speak roughly at the same time, regardless of the emphasis of language within that culture. Now, what are the cultural differences though between those countries is more of the complexity of the given language within that culture. So, for example, exposing children a lot to language, while they may start to talk the same time as a country that doesn't focus on language of children or another culture, their fluency within their language tends to be better. Okay. And so we see these cultural differences, but we also see, as far as language, it occurs roughly at the same time. We'll also look at rearing practices within the developmental. How do children respond to different rearing practices across cultures? So there's families who are very stoic, where the parents are very not invested in their children's emotions. They're not invested in some cultures even addressing the child as a child. Whereas there's other cultures who focus very much on, that socio-emotional connection with the caregiver. And we'll look at different cultural outcomes for those two different cultural outcomes. Okay. And then we'll also look near the end of the lifespan. How do cultures treat things like death and bereavement. And we will see that while there are some commonalities between what humans need to go through the bereavement process, culture kind of determines how to go through those processes. All right, and I'm not going to focus on these very much because I already mentioned them during the um, previous notions. When I talked about behaviorism, the cognitive approach has kind of brought back the idea that our values, our morals, our thought processes matter, and they do have an impact on who we are. So we can kind of combine this, cognition and behaviorism kind of are now working together. And then the biological perspective is do we all, dependent on culture, what is cultural's influence on brain processes? Is there differences in brain development, and does that matter? So if we find, for example, a good example, and this isn't maybe a cultural example, is we have found that the corpus callosum, the thing that connects our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere, tend to be thinner in women, I believe. And no, I think it's thicker. Um, and so, but what does that mean, right? Because we also, if we look at different disorders, individuals with schizophrenia have thicker corpus callosums. So what is the interpretation to say that there's different growth areas, there's thicker areas in some area of the brain compared to two populations or not? I mean, what is the meaning behind that? And that's where the complexity, especially when we start talking about cross cultures, that's the complexity of it, is does it really mean anything? Because I would assume that not all women are schizophrenic because they both have a thickened corpus callosum. That's just a thought, or I think just an observation that anybody with a full processing mind would come to a conclusion that the answer to that is no. So we want to look at these differences in brain functioning, and we'll get to that as we move along. All right. The main approach that we're going to take when we're looking at cultures, and this just kind of is to summarize this because we're almost out of time, is when we're looking at these cross cultures, or when we're looking at a single culture in this class, we're going to look at it in three specific areas. We're going to look at it in the biological areas. What is the biological differences? And so, I just want to wrap this up. And then we're going to look at the social areas, the social systems, kind of like what we did with the intimate parenting processes between the Western culture and Amazonian culture. And then we're going to look at the psychological. How do people interpret their world and navigate their world within that given culture? Okay. All right. Let me stop recording because we're almost stopped sharing.